Judges, would you like to introduce yourselves?
Yes, thank you. My name is Rebecca Steinhoff. I am joining today from Casper, Wyoming. I am the Executive Director of the John P. L. Bogan Foundation, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing from you today.
Hello, everyone. My name is Scott Barnhart. I'm currently in Indianapolis, Indiana. I'm an attorney. I work at the Indiana Attorney General's Office. I serve as the Chief Counsel and Director of the Consumer Protection Division. And I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
I'm Marcia Holland. I'm in Missoula, Montana. I'm an attorney also. My legal career was primarily spent as a career public defender in Fairbanks, Alaska. But having moved back to Montana, I now teach at the law school here and just finished the 9th of my Zoom mock trials. So I'm really thrilled that the center was able to allow this national competition to continue and look forward to hearing from you.
Hi, I'm Ben Phillips, and in addition to We the People, I'm also on my school's Model UN and speech and debate teams.
I'm Drew Allen. I am an Eagle Scout and I play varsity baseball for our high school.
I'm Aubrey Bradshaw and I run cross country on our team and sing in our choir. And our coaches are Miss Limbaum and Miss Litzenberger.
Wonderful, thank you. Well, this is Unit 6, and we will hear from you this afternoon. Question number 2. President Dwight D. Eisenhower said, "We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence by military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. Do you agree or disagree? Why? What disagreements did the founders have about a standing army, and are they relevant today? To what extent should there be an international U.S. military presence?" You may begin when you're ready.
We agree with Eisenhower. The economic incentives of private defense corporations combined with significant congressional influence create a perpetually paranoid culture in which any threat is inflated to whatever degree is necessary to justify higher spending. The founders feared the raw power of a standing army was a threat to democracy, which to some extent is still relevant, but is considerably outweighed by budgetary and political concerns.
The iron triangle of defense corporations, the Department of Defense, and members of Congress is what constitutes the military-industrial complex. The continual demand for weaponry caused by the Cold War fueled the emergence of an arms sector of the private economy that had a significant incentive to keep weapons demand high.
Eisenhower's fear of misplaced power stems from Congress's susceptibility to making irresponsible decisions in regards to military action and spending. Defense corporations have spent about $1 billion on lobbying since 2011 to raise defense spending caps originally implemented to reduce the national debt. In the executive branch, the Secretary of Defense holds the power to create government contracts with defense corporations, as well as great influence over public sentiment in America.
For example, The Atlantic reports that former Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld demanded that his staff, quote, keep elevating the threat level of al-Qaeda after 9/11 to scare Americans into supporting the war on terror. Many recent secretaries of defense, including Jim Mattis, Mark Esper, and Lloyd Austin, have worked for defense corporations, presenting a clear threat of undue influence as those corporations have an incentive for the U.S. to pursue aggressive military efforts.
The founders also recognized the danger of undue military influence, but rooted their concerns in the prospect of a standing army. In Anti-Federalist 24 and 25, Brutus declares that a standing army would subvert the forms of government according to the pleasure of its leaders. Madison agreed, explaining that the executive and military would not long be safe companions to liberty.
Some founders, notably Hamilton in Federalist 25, refuted the fears of a standing army and stressed its importance to national defense. The Constitution addresses these sentiments by dividing the powers of war and military maintenance. Article 2, Section 2 makes the President Commander-in-Chief of the military, while Article 1, Section 8 grants Congress the power to declare war and to raise and support an army.
Today, Madison's fears of executive dominance over the army are the most relevant, with no formal declaration of war by Congress since World War II, despite U.S. involvement in 5 major wars and countless international conflicts. However, Brutus's concerns about erosion of civil liberties by standing armies are not particularly relevant today, as Hamilton's view of a standing army as a necessity for the defense of any major modern nation has largely prevailed. The real debate today is the international question.
We do not require the expansive physical presence the U.S. currently maintains. With over 800 international bases, the U.S. has roughly 90% of the world's foreign bases. American University's David Vine estimates that the cost of bases in non-combat zones is $71 billion annually.
The US should drastically reduce its base count, as military bases are largely inefficient and outdated due to advancements in travel reducing response time. According to the Rand Corporation, bases are also not strong enough to deter large-scale attacks. However, the US should still operate essential bases, such as Guam and Diego Garcia, which are geographically capable of countering China.
Further, the US should send more troops to NATO's Enhanced Forward Presence program to check Russia and reaffirm its commitments to allies. Finally, the US should continue to support UN initiatives against terrorism.
Military is an indispensable insurance policy, but the extreme political clout that defense corporations wield turns foreign policy discussions into insurance ads. Danger must always be present, otherwise there's no demand for their products.
America must break this mindset, where we will continue to overspend on our insurance, anticipating chaos in every corner of the world. Further, peace becomes impossible, as the profits of these corporations necessitate conflict.
Thank you. So I'm curious to know what impacts contraction, either physical contraction or financial contraction, of the military would have on our reputation throughout the world as a superpower.
I would say that the effect of our military contraction, if we reduce spending, can largely be minimized by the fact that we don't necessarily need a base presence in these regions to maintain US military commitments. We can maintain strategic alliances like that with NATO by, again, supporting things like the Enhanced Forward Presence program. And we can still uphold defense treaties such as the one we have with Taiwan or South Korea by just being there for those nations if they are attacked. A military base does not necessitate or is not necessitated for US commitments to its allies.
Exactly. Scaling back military bases does not mean that we're scaling back the US's reputation as a global military power. For instance, when China began exercising control over the South China Sea, introducing their 9-dash line, making 3,200 acres of new land in the South China Sea, instituting bases in the area, the US, it wasn't because the US had a base in the area that it is able to protect free trade moving through that waterway. It was the fact that the US sent its Navy to protect free trade, the 33% of global trade that moves through that waterway. So that is what the US still can do, and it's a more efficient way of projecting international power.
And I think it's important to remember that there's other forms of military presence, and one of those is over cyber warfare or cyber allies with other countries. Currently, we have a US cyber command force with 4 different branches that, while it may not be as well known as the typical boots on the ground military, as warfare becomes more less physical, I think we'll see a increase in that influence. And I think remembering that and the allies that we have, especially with Australia, just in December, we started doing practices with them over cyber warfare. So I think it's important to note that it's not always physical.
Well, you actually almost stole the question I was going to ask you and have already asked it or answered it. So let me ask you this. Traditionally, the draft has been used when we need to up military presence in cases of war, although as you pointed out, there's been 5 conflicts that weren't really wars. Do you think the draft should be abolished at this point because it's not really meaningful? Or if not, should everyone 18 and older be registered in the draft?
I think that the draft is still a very important aspect of the U.S. military, because if we're talking, because a lot of the conflicts right now are largely lesser in scale, and so the U.S. can deploy its existing military to the area and address those conflicts. But if we were to get into a large-scale conflict, say with Russia or China, then the draft would come in handy because we would need to expand our military to meet that conflict, and that's exactly what the draft does.
Unfortunately, I have to disagree with Drew on this one, because I would argue the draft should be abolished as it serves as a form of involuntary servitude, which was supposed to be abolished by the 13th Amendment. And the fact is that if civilians don't support the United States' international efforts abroad and therefore don't sign up for the military, then that should be a signal to the United States that it shouldn't be engaging in those military activities.
Thank you.
Was too busy taking notes to ask the next question. You mentioned the influence that lobbyists have in this military complex. So I'm curious, do you think that there should be a limit placed on the sphere of the influence from those lobbyists from military contractors?
I think there should be some form of limit. I think especially the lobbyists that are in these big corporations that are donating to campaigns, they should have a limit. And there was an act called the Tillman Act that was instituted in 1907, and it was repealed, but I think it should be reinstated because it prevents corporations from donating large sums of money to these different campaigns that will forward their agenda. Look at Boeing, they spent in 2018 $4.8 million, and that was a midterm election. So I think there should be a limit put on the amount of money that lobbyists and corporations can donate.
And in addition to money, I think the biggest thing that we can do to prevent these prevent lobbying like this is to prevent the cycle from congressional candidates going back into these corporations to further lobby for things like the military. In the 1970s, only 3% of congressional candidates went from Congress into these corporations to begin lobbying. But in 2017, that amount has increased to 43%. So these people are going, it's this consistent cycle of people going from Congress into corporations to lobby for more aggressive military efforts. And that is something that I think we need to stop.
Further, the US should extend this crackdown not only to lobbying of members of Congress, but it should restrict what stocks members of Congress should own. In fact, it's estimated by Project Oversight that 51 members of Congress right now own stocks in the top 30 defense companies, meaning they have a clear financial incentive to engage in more aggressive military efforts.
So what I hear from you all saying is that, well, I'm curious to know your position on whether we should prohibit a complete prohibition or a restriction on the use of contractors, military contractors separate and apart from the military itself. What's your position on that?
I think that we should restrict the use of contractors because they're not subject to the same regulations that the military has, and they end up and they can further U.S. into additional conflicts. So, like in Afghanistan, for instance, when we employed contractors to protect senators and officials that were in the area, those contractors were getting the U.S. into skirmishes with the civilian population that the military would not have done. So, and the military doesn't have, and they don't have the same regulations on them as the military does. So we do need to restrict contractors.
So I'm afraid we're going to run out of time, but let me ask this. Do you think that the US should use more diplomatic means and up the diplomatic corps and reduce the military corps? For example, make sure that our diplomats are strategically placed around the globe rather than having several military bases in places like Germany, where we haven't been in conflict with Germany since World War II.
I think we should. I think it's super important to pay attention to the influence that the State Department can have with embassies and diplomats. And we've had a lot of success with this. And I think the only instance where military should be brought in is when diplomatic means fails, or they can work together. We see that in Kosovo in 1999, we sent troops along with the UN to Kosovo to promote peace and stabilize their government and their citizens. And we're currently slowly pulling them out as their forces build up. But I think that was a great example of diplomacy and military working together to promote peace and democracy. So I think we should definitely either pair them or focus on democracy first. And if that fails, move in with military.
Diplomacy should absolutely come before military intervention, but even if diplomacy fails, there are other routes for the United States to impact other nations other than military, not sacrificing US troops. For example, these sanctions that the US placed on Iraq prior to the invasion in the early 2000s decreased the country's GDP by about 15%, which would be crippling to any economy. Therefore, the United States can still exert influence through non-military means.
Time.
Yay.
I could give so many good comments here. I'm trying to figure out where even to begin. You did a really exceptional job. You started off really strong and clear with your prepared remarks. There was a strong sense of coherence from the way that you very directly addressed each of the prompts in the question, and that carried through to the question and answer where we got to hear even more from you. So I think you had really rich examples and a lot of context in those opening remarks, both kind of how the historical fears played out in the current context. I thought you did a really nice job in thinking about some of the concerns or disagreements that the founders had and what that looked like in this current lens, and really appreciated connecting those dots and just talking about the dynamics that are included in some of this. Really, I think, good information about the current situation in contractors and some of what's happening. So a lot of really great information. I think you also had some really strong evidence just in citing some of the current or recent military engagements, and also bringing in things like let's reinstate the Tillman Act. So a lot of really great depth to your perspective and your insight. So you have very clearly prepared for your remarks in terms of addressing the questions that were asked, but had a wealth of knowledge. So we could spend much longer than we have hearing from you, but really enjoyed what you did prepare and were able to share in the time that we had. Thank you.
You know, I agree with that. I think your passion about your position in terms of the notion that the military is overexpansive and fear mongering is absolutely evident. I particularly appreciated your use of citations. You know, a lot of times teams, they say, oh, well, the Constitution said this. No, Article 1, Section 2 said this, and that it's a demonstrative of you studying and working with material. So I certainly appreciate that. I also appreciate the use of follow-up or the cyber warfare example and follow-up. It serves you well if you are giving answers that anticipates our questions, right? So that is definitely a good sign. I would give some thought in terms of the notion that, or the suggestion that we should have, you know, sort of a popular vote, if you will, for participation in the military, right? The suggestion that perhaps, you know, should be democratic, because sometimes these decisions are tough and sometimes they are contrary to the populist opinion. And, you know, I would have liked to have heard a little bit more balanced approach on that. And I would also give some thought in terms of, well, now that we have this engine, some of these bases and some of these companies are economic engines for the United States, right? So extracting that out and removing that will have perhaps unintended consequences. And in terms of maybe there's some utility in having this, even though maybe we wouldn't have made the decision to get there if we had Eisenhower made different decisions, or we'd made different decisions previously. But now that we're here, perhaps there are some ancillary benefits to it. Just a thought, but nicely done. Good job.
I always appreciate language as telling part of the story in terms of persuasive argument. And so in your prepared remarks, talking about the concept of a threat being amplified and even artificially amplified in order to keep these industrial complex engines going, and then using Rumsfeld as keep raising that threat level. I mean, that really, it happened in our lifetime. And I think it really evokes a really clear response or image of what the point you were trying to make. So to choose those kinds of language and examples can be so powerful. And I really appreciate the thoughtfulness that went into your prepared remarks. And especially just noting there's been no formal declaration of war since World War II, and yet the military continues to expand. I think that's a really important point that often is lost in this question, but you as a group brought it up. I think that's has real value. And you really did pre-answer my question that I was going to ask you. So that's always great. And then in your answers, you had specific examples. It's almost like you did anticipate our questions. I mean, the free-form questions as well. You talked about the diplomat military cooperation in Kosovo, and then you talked about sanctions can be as effective as military, and that you talked about 1907, no corporate donations in the Tillman Act. And if there was more time, I was going to ask you, maybe we can revisit Citizens United by using defense contractors as a different example of influence. So they're really not an individual. And so if there was more time, but see, I really appreciate how thought-provoking your prepared remarks were, but especially the comments you made in answering our questions. because I think each of the three of us would wish we could get one more question each at least in order to talk with you more, but great job. Thank you so much.